Hello, you guys, and welcome to this week's podcast episode. This week is another guest episode, and I am so excited to release this episode. This is a discussion with somebody who is absolutely incredible at what she does. I am chatting with Emmy. Bloomingwithemmy is what she's known as on Instagram and across other social platforms, and she's a trauma-informed coach from California. She is also a trauma survivor. She is a writer and an educator with a mission to help others reclaim their power, reject shame, and walk boldly towards a life of balance, freedom, and joy. So as you can imagine, any podcast episodes I do around trauma, I just absolutely love them because this is the type of stuff that lights me up. So within this episode, we talk about trauma bonds, we talk about why teenage violence and experienced trauma as a teenager can actually have a massive impact in who you are as an adult and why that should be spoken about more. We speak about why community is so important. We speak about what gaslighting is, and obviously we speak about self-love and why that is also so important when somebody is on a healing journey after they've experienced trauma. So I hope you love this episode. Please tag me and Emmy on Instagram and let us know what your biggest takeaway from it was. Let us know what you enjoyed. And if you enjoyed it and you want to leave a review, that would also be incredible. So please subscribe, download, all of the things. I am so grateful that you are here listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. And yeah, I shall catch you next week for another episode. Enjoy. Hello, Emmy. Thank you for being here on the podcast.
Hello, thank you.
I could not think of a better person for this topic, and that is just why I had to reach out and ask you. So please introduce yourself for people listening.
Yeah, so my name is Emmy Marie. I am a certified trauma-informed life coach, and I'm also a trauma survivor myself. And I really am just passionate about helping trauma survivors have thriving lives and relationships. So I make a lot of courses and coaching programs and workshops and a lot of free content, mostly on Instagram, to try to create community and create supportive experiences for trauma survivors to really ultimately have a better life after a painful or traumatic past.
I love that. And because what's really nice is there's a community that's being set up in the UK called I Am Arla, and I know you shared your story on that. Why is community so important when it comes to trauma?
Yeah, wow, that's a really good question. So for a lot of people who have experienced a plethora of forms of trauma, they may have experienced a lot of isolation. If you were abused or neglected or anything under that umbrella, there's typically a lot of isolation that's experienced throughout those experiences. But also, whether you have trauma from really any source, it can often make you feel like there's something wrong with you, or other people aren't walking through life the same way you are, and you're having a lot of symptoms and experiences that other people don't understand, which can be really, really isolating and ultimately perpetuate that trauma within our bodies. So community is really the antidote to that isolation, to feel like we aren't alone in this, that we have people we can reach out to and count on and rely on, and also just people that we also know may be struggling with similar things, and really just building up that sense of there are other people in this with me. So, yeah.
I love that. And I think also the community aspect, when someone has experienced trauma, can just, that in itself for somebody to say, I get it, I understand how you feel. And I know trauma is very different for every person, but what I've found working with women with trauma is it in a way it's so like not similar, but it's so relatable. It's something that women and obviously men, but I just work with women, but it's something that people they're just like, I get you, like I get it. And I think that's that's a really, really beautiful process to be able to give somebody that. So your abuse was when you were a teenager, and I've seen you speak about it on lives on Instagram and, you know, on your websites and things like that. You shared your story.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about why you think it's really important to raise awareness on this? Because I know that's one of the things you spoke about on the live was, you know, the awareness is the things that happen as teenagers. So why is that important to you?
Yeah. So I, as you mentioned briefly, for people who don't know, am a survivor of teen dating violence, or, you know, kind of this intersection between like ultimately child abuse and then adult like domestic. So this is an experience that so many people have in their teenage years, being in an abusive relationship, possibly the first relationship they've ever had. You know, a lot of childhood trauma survivors are very prone to being in abusive relationships right from the jump, because if they had abuse modeled to them by their families, which is not my experience, but I see that as a very common thing. And so it does feel like this form of trauma that sometimes gets left behind when people are focused a lot on, you know, child abuse or adult domestic violence. There is this intersection here where teenagers get in really intense relationships. Teenagers have a lot going on in their bodies already, and can, you know, have some really traumatic things going on. And I think, you know, for me, I didn't really feel like there was anyone teaching me what an abusive relationship was, what was okay and what was not, as far as dating and relationships went. Never really learned about consent or empowerment at all. So I felt like kind of clear on, you know, the systems that we live in, that, you know, it's not just me that hasn't had that education, but I'm sure, you know, there's hundreds of thousands or millions of people who have also had bad experiences due to a lack of understanding of what really is okay and what isn't. So I try to spread a lot of awareness and advocacy, not only because it's, you know, the situation that I understand best since I went through it myself, but also I do feel like there's this gap that I try to fill with my work, because it can lead to really lasting damage and trauma just as much as any other form of interpersonal violence. So, yeah.
Do you feel like there is a minimization sometimes that occurs for the teenage, you know, relationships? Because I know when you hear people speak about teenagers, it's like, oh, the finding the feet. It wasn't really a relationship, and you notice all of these excuses come to play. So is that something you found as well?
Yes, yeah, that's a huge point. Is I do think, you know, even teenage relationships that go well or maybe end in some sort of heartbreak are often really minimized as like, well, they're just kids or they're just teenagers. Like, it was just a bad breakup, you know, it was a mistake. Like, you'll get over it. And I think that can do a lot of damage to people, even outside of abusive relationships, but within an abusive context, you know, if people are telling you, you know, it wasn't that bad, like, oh, you know, it was just a bad relationship, like, you'll get over it. No matter what age you are, hearing that sort of dismissal and that minimization is right in alignment with what an abuser would say to you, which is, you know, you're making such a big deal out of this. You're being so dramatic. You're being so emotional. Like, I didn't even do anything to you. And just that continual process of gaslighting can be, you know, deeply traumatic and lead to a lot of self-doubt or feeling disconnected from our own internal knowing that something is wrong and this wasn't okay. So, yes.
What was interesting when you were talking is I was thinking about when you said gaslighting. I was thinking, how many of my audience would fully understand what that is? So could you just explain, you know, how you teach it? What is gaslighting?
Yeah, so gaslighting is basically when someone gets you to doubt your own inner knowing of your feelings or your experience or the objective truth. So, gaslighting is basically, an example would be someone lies to you and you say, hey, I noticed that you said this thing and this is what actually happened. And they say, no, I never said that. No, I never did that. And that's kind of a really obvious, like overt example of gaslighting, when someone is directly telling you like the objective reality is not true. But there's way more kind of like subtle forms of gaslighting, where kind of the example I just used, if you are hurt by something and crying and, you were just screamed at or, insulted really deeply or hurt in some way, and you express that emotional pain you're feeling, and someone says, quit being a baby, get over it, you're so dramatic, it basically is belittling your emotional expression and ultimately teaching you that to doubt your reality, to doubt your feelings, because that is how someone gets more control over you, if you're perpetually doubting yourself.
And I feel like I've been in experiences before where that's happened, and it's difficult for me without trauma. So I could not imagine the space that sends someone into who's experienced trauma, or if someone is gaslighting them in relation to the trauma or their feelings around that experience. And the unfortunate thing is, I feel like the women I spoke to at some point that has happened. And what would you say to anybody listening who's thinking, oh my God, yes, that's happened to me?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, if you're hearing this and you're feeling a little shocked or a little, startled by how much this is resonating, please just know that you aren't alone. And, some of the ways that I teach healing from gaslighting would be ultimately increasing your sense of self-trust by starting to really tune in to your emotional landscape, your physical sensations, your needs, whether they be physical or emotional or spiritual, or just the needs that you have as a human being, recognizing that those exist, and then seeing, if there's ways that you may be ignoring those needs or minimizing your feelings or completely dismissing your emotions, and seeing if you can find ways to reunite with, your own personal sense of self-trust, your own ability to not just take care of yourself, but also reach out for help if you need it. It doesn't mean you do everything on your own, but I do think there has to be something that happens within you where you start to say, this emotion is valid. This sensation I'm having is valid. It doesn't mean it's always true. I've had a lot of intrusive thoughts or a lot of really overwhelming feelings of fear that were not necessarily like intuitive reality, but still valid. Anything you're feeling that's coming up is totally valid and allowed to be there. It doesn't mean you necessarily act on it, but yeah, I would say, starting to reunite with your own inner knowing and acting accordingly as much as possible.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. And that really links into a lot of stuff I talk about in terms of,
nice.
And this is what I'm going to ask you, but like around the self-love piece and why it's so important when it comes to this process of coming back to yourself after, trauma and when you're on that process of healing. But I think one of the things you were saying around it's gone, but it will come back. You were talking, you've literally just spoke about it and it's gone, but it'll come back.
Okay.
What I did want to ask you is, one of the things I always say, especially when I speak to or work with women who've experienced trauma, is that trauma has no time frame. So it does not know if it's been 20 years and you're married with kids, it won't adapt itself and show up in a way that suits where you are now. It will come up as it was in the moment. Like, it doesn't work on time. So that's one of the reasons why I asked you that question around the teenage element of it, because I think the thing that seems really important for me is that aspect of time. And I think I know when I say that to a lot of people, they go, oh yeah, because they always say, well, time's a healer. And I'm like,
Right.
Is it?
Right. Yeah, I completely agree with everything you're saying. And I think, the kind of saying that time is a healer or time heals everything is not necessarily untrue, but it might not be applicable to trauma, where it's like, sure, time might heal heartbreak or grief if you let yourself feel those things. But with trauma, there's often like a really intense disconnection from our emotions and processing what have like really trauma is a result of not being able to or choosing not to process what happened in the past that was really hurtful and scary. So yeah, trauma is not healed by time alone. That being said, it does get better and there's a lot you can do within that time. But yeah, if you're still something that happened when you were a child or a teenager, that doesn't mean that you're failing or you're weak or anything like that. It's just, the pain demands to be felt, or, the experiences you went through are asking you to pay attention to them, which is really hard.
Yeah, I could imagine. So one of the other things I wanted to ask you about is, what can you tell us about trauma bonds?
Yeah. So, I want to be clear that I don't have like the explicit definition of trauma bonding or trauma bonds, but I'll just speak to it a little bit. So my understanding is a trauma bond, it would be an emotional or attachment bond between you and another person that is forged or solidified during traumatic experiences, whether I'm imagining it would be a dysfunctional or abusive relationship where there is a tremendous amount of initial love bombing or attachment or a lot of, I'm this person for you. I'm going to meet all your needs. I am perfect. You are so wonderful. We are totally in love, and forms this human bond or attachment or trauma bond. At that point, it's not necessarily traumatic, but this deep bond that if anyone's ever been in love or, had a strong relationship with a caregiver or attachment figure, you know what that feels like. But trauma bond, then something bad starts happening. For me, I was in an abusive relationship that there was a lot of verbal and emotional abuse that was really slowly trickled in there. So it's usually not just one day someone flips a switch and it's totally different, but rather it starts subtly creeping in where they are starting to control you or belittle you or demean you, while also at the same time telling you how they're the only person for you and how they love you so much and how, you're never going to find anything better than them. And so what this can really create is this bond that is, extremely strong and powerful. And so when your logical brain is telling you like, this isn't good, even years later, even if you leave the relationship and you're like, I know this person was abusive and bad for me, there might be this other part of you that's like, but I loved them, but they loved me, we are bonded together. So that can be a really, really hard thing to not only break that bond, but then also live with in the aftermath of, why does a part of me miss someone who was actively abusing me? But ultimately, those are all parts that can be respected and integrated and allowed to be there, but it's very counterintuitive. And I don't think there's much advocacy in the world of people saying like, hey, it's understandable if you still miss someone that you are deeply afraid of or no longer want in your life, but it is very normal.
Yeah. And I love that you've just said that's normal, because I think that whole situation can bring up a lot of self-shame, like confusion, a lot of guilt, a lot of misunderstanding.
Right.
And I think part of that process can often make women isolate more because they don't want to tell people I miss this person. And I just think that's such a difficult space to navigate. But one of the things I want listeners to understand, if they resonate with this, is it's okay. Like, it's okay. And, it's not as easy as often you think it may be, or people can tell you it is, or any of those things, because it is exactly like you've said, it's complicated and it's deep, and it's often this bond that people don't necessarily understand or get. Only it's like that thing that only you feel. It's like how you feel about that person.
Right.
One of the other elements of that I wanted to ask you about briefly was the adaptive survival styles, because I just think this is really interesting. And I think this is the type of stuff, exactly as the podcast says, little girls aren't taught this. We are not taught about this really, really important stuff. And I know there's a lot of trauma survivors who may not have even heard of these things.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So the 5 adaptive survival styles is the work of Dr. Lawrence Heller, who created NARM, which is a model for treating complex trauma that I am trained in, working on my certification right now. But really, these 5 adaptive survival styles are things that come about when you've been in some form of complex, ongoing, chronic trauma, where you have to kind of adapt to constant feelings of unsafety or danger or injury. And so they kind of develop, it's said they develop, throughout your childhood based on the developmental period. And they are, a connection. So ability to connect with another person, connect with yourself. Attunement, being able to, attune or pay attention to inner sensations, external processes, or, visual cues, stuff like that. Trust, ability to trust yourself and others. Autonomy, the ability to feel like you're allowed to make your own decisions for yourself and have control and agency. And then love and sexuality, which is the one that's developed the latest, according to this model, where, you get to the point where you're ready to make like relational ties with another person that are safe and healthy. And so how these, those are all core capacities that every single human being hopefully is developing as they grow: connection, attunement, trust, autonomy, and love and sexuality later on. But, if trauma gets in the way, it can really disrupt that development, leading to issues with, all those 5 things I just mentioned. And so, yeah, it's just a framework for really looking at maybe how complex trauma has impacted you. And, if you work with a NARM professional, that's sort of what they're, thinking about and doing. And I feel like I really like it because it humanizes the person, and it can help you understand yourself better, and not as like, I'm broken or I have no idea what's going on, but rather like, oh, like my ability to trust others was ruptured because of XYZ, not like, oh, I just have trust issues because I'm bad or there's something wrong with me. So yeah, it's a really interesting form of understanding complex trauma.
That sounds amazing. Also, one of the really cool things is I looked this year to train as a non-professional.
Nice.
Practitioner. Yeah, I know, but I'm gonna finish the masters I'm doing and then go into that.
Cool.
How has learning about these things helped you on your journey and also helped your clients?
Yeah. Wow. That's a really good question. Yeah. I mean, I feel like every time I do a training, it's kind of like coming home in a way, or just that feeling of like deep resonance where you're like, wow, like I make sense. Like I remember the first time I read the book, The Body Keeps the Score. And it's just like, oh, like, okay, so all these things I'm experiencing aren't like completely solely unique. Like other people have gone through this. Trauma is real. Trauma, it does impact the brain and the body. So, that's generally my experience when I am learning about complex trauma in general, and also about how to work with it. And, as a coach, as a healing practitioner, I definitely feel like it's sort of hard to convey the merit of working with a professional until you do it, because especially if you're someone that's survived by doing everything on your own or being super independent, which that's what I did. it's a big risk to open up to someone else and allow them into your life, allow them to see you in some capacity and understand what you're going through. That can feel really scary and risky, but ultimately sometimes the things that are the most scary or the most difficult are the really medicinal experiences we need to have, where, you know, sitting with someone and having them be an open, compassionate witness to what you're learning about yourself can be so transformative, because it really shows you like there are kind people, there are people that understand, there is hope for a better future. So yeah, it's kind of hard to really narrow down, but I feel like ultimately all the training that I've done and the frameworks that I use are really just like human first and looking at clients as a whole person that has already done so much to even make it to here today, that it's often not that you need to do anything more, but rather more come into contact with your authentic self. And that sounds a lot easier than it is.
Yeah. I remember when I worked with a client last year and she had dealt with trauma for 11 years. She actually done a podcast episode with me, which was just incredible. It was like a pinch me moment. Yeah. And what was really interesting is that survival that you were talking about then, and she had her ways and she had her stuff together, and she thought she was coping and everything was totally fine. And then it was like she got to a breaking point where the anxiety and the fear and all of that stuff come up, and she was like, I need to do something about it. And through the process of working with me, she realized that actually she had in a way been controlling it, but the control she thought she had to the certain level was actually not that. And actually the trauma was coming up and controlling so many elements of her life. And that was like a really big process for her to go through, because she was like, I thought I had my shit together for 11 years. In one way she did, but it was being in that, she didn't realize she was in survival mode. And that was huge.
Yeah. The distinction between survival mode and, you know, actually being present and feeling safe in our bodies can be baffling, or, you know, really difficult to discern between when you, especially if you've grown up in some sort of chaotic environment that taught you how to endure stress from a young age.
Yeah. What is your advice to somebody living in trauma? And one of that's a question just come to mind. Sorry, can you just briefly tell me the difference between trauma and complex trauma? Because I know for me, studying with the qualification that I'm doing to become a psychotherapist, when I'm learning about trauma psychotherapy, trauma-based psychotherapy, the way they define trauma is very different from, let's say, if you go to social media and how you see trauma spoken about. So for you, what or like through your teachings, what is the difference?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think that's a kind of a hot topic right now, is what even is trauma. And I think it's very different if you're going to get a diagnosis and, you know, go through therapy and you're working to like treat a mental illness and try to get that PTSD diagnosis, versus if you are realizing that something from your past is showing up in your life, but you are still able to function. You're not in a crisis mode, etc. So from my understanding, in the school of thought that's presented in NARM, that I guess I'll reference now because I agree with it. There is one thing that is like shock trauma, where say you get into a really terrible, horrifying car accident and you survive, and you now are really afraid to be in a car again. That could be a form of shock trauma or PTSD. If you're going to get that diagnosis, versus complex trauma is typically an experience that comes after long-term chronic situations where you're put in a position of danger or perceived danger. So that could look like growing up with abuse or neglect in your home, having a long-term relationship that is abusive or neglectful, experiencing systemic oppression, all sorts of stuff. Like we don't need to list all of things, but something that's ongoing that that you don't sense that you can escape from, or you can't get the impression that it will ever end. That can typically result in a more complex form of trauma that really impacts your sense of self, as in, if you get in a really bad car accident and you have PTSD, you probably aren't thinking there is something irrevocably wrong with me. I'm a bad person. You don't have all these identity things going on. It's just like, I'm scared to get in a car because I was in a car accident. Versus complex trauma typically leads to really intense shame, or at least a rupture in your identity. So it can be, really, really deep and impacting every area of your life.
Mm-hmm. Just like a side question for that, so the complex trauma with the elements of the ongoing, people I've worked with have had one-off incidents of rape, and that has had the same result. Just for people listening to this who think, well, mine wasn't ongoing, or it was one experience, or it can still have that same impact on it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And thank you. And I mean, it's one thing, also we live in a world that is filled with rape culture, filled with, so many forms of systemic oppression, such as misogyny and, literally people blaming survivors of sexual assault or not believing them at all. So it's almost like we live in a world that is traumatic in that regard. So if you even have a one-time incident, it's a lot less likely that you're going to feel safe to even talk about it, there's that compounding effect. So, but yes, I really it's very hard for me when people are like, so what is trauma? Because it's like, I don't want people to limit themselves. If you're experiencing something that you consider traumatic, or please don't doubt your experience, reach out for help if you need help. We don't need to gatekeep trauma.
No, absolutely not. I think the definitions only come into play really in my world. It's obviously if I'm studying, whatever school of thought you're looking at, you have to take that definition into play. Sure. And then also, like you said, if you're going down a mental health diagnosis, but exactly what you said, if it feels like something for you, then that's your experience, and it's about unpacking that and understanding that. That's the most important thing, really. So last question I want to ask you, why is self-love important for trauma?
Yeah. Well, I think self-love is important for everyone, but if you are a survivor, but if you're a survivor of especially something like interpersonal abuse or violence, you were probably made to hate yourself in some regard, whether someone was directly telling you that there's something wrong with you, that you are unlovable, that you are never going to be good enough. That's direct shaming or direct teaching you how to hate yourself. But also, shame and self-hatred can come about to just try to explain why we feel unsafe all the time, or why, we feel like we're different than everyone else because of trauma. So, people, for example, that go through a lot of medical trauma, it's not like a person saying, hey, you're bad and you should hate yourself, but if you have had experiences where your body is no longer under your control and you don't feel like you have agency or autonomy, it's really easy to develop a lot of shame and self-hatred. And so if we're thinking about self-love, that's ultimately kind of the exact opposite of shame and self-hatred. And it's like if someone or something got you to the place of really being super hard on yourself all the time, or openly hating yourself, then, self-love is a really radical, revolutionary act that is definitely not easy, but it can really open the doors to feeling safe in your body, having joy again, having that sense of agency and autonomy that allows you to, thrive. And if we're going to open it up to relationships too, it's like, if you are stuck in a pattern of shame and self-hatred, it's a lot more likely that you might choose or tolerate being around people who double down on that and amplify that. And that can often lead in, repeating the cycle of abuse. to the most extreme version, or just not being happy in relationships in general. So while I don't think you have to love yourself before you can love someone else, if you do, it might set you up for a lot more happy, safety, and stability.
Yeah, I love that answer. And I think one of the things that I always say, well, one of my big messages with self-love and trauma is just there's like the worthiness piece. It's like I always want people to know that they are whole and worthy, like no matter what. And you know, just because they've had an experience and they're going through that process of trying to understand that experience, it does not mean that they are not whole and worthy of love right now in this moment, whether that's from somebody else or themselves. And I think one of the big things that I want to do going forward with I Am Arla is really help women step into that and be like, okay, this is one element of you, but look at all these other incredible elements that make you who you are. And just really like bring that empowerment piece back to survivors. I think that for me is where self-love comes into it when it comes to trauma. And it's just like, it's just so rewarding and gorgeous, and I love it.
Yeah. I mean, like my whole thing, you know, I'm not a therapist, I'm a coach, so I'm not qualified to diagnose or treat trauma as much as I try to educate and talk about it. That's not in my scope of practice. So I'm way more on that empowerment side of like, you know, a lot of my clients have been in therapy before or are currently in it, and they are ready to, you know, elevate their life in some capacity, whether it's have better relationships, have better work-life balance, or, you know, family life, but really want to find what lights them up and makes them happy despite having a traumatic past. So I totally resonate with what you said.
Oh, I love that. Well, thank you so much for being on and jumping on in the morning and starting your day off with me. It's been lovely. Thank you so much
for having me.
Where can people find you and how can they work with you?
Yeah, so you can find me. My website is emmymarie.com. I am at Bloomingwithemmy on Instagram and TikTok and Pinterest. I do have one-to-one coaching programs. I have group courses and workshops. And in 2022, I'm going to be creating a low-cost membership. So lots of ways to work with me, and you can see all of that on my website if you're interested.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much.